To himself from
Put it down! Drop it!
Relax! You're late, all right? My name's Alan, Barry Allen, United States Secret Service.
The scene you just watched is only a few minutes long, but it might be the most important scene in all of Catch Me If You Can, because this is the moment Frank Abagnale should get caught. Not almost caught, not nearly caught, caught. Everything is finally in place. The FBI knows where he is. Carl Hanratty knows which room he's hiding in. The evidence is inside. The chase is over. At least, that's what Spielberg wants us to believe. And that's what makes this scene so fascinating, because by the end of it, Frank simply walks away. No car chase, no shootout, no elaborate escape plan. He just talks his way out. Now, on paper, that shouldn't work. Carl has every advantage. He's older, he's experienced, he's an FBI agent. Frank is just a teenager pretending to be someone he's not. And yet somehow, the person holding the gun ends up losing control of the situation. That's the genius of this scene. Most movies create tension by asking a simple question. Will the hero succeed? This scene asks a different question. How can somebody fail when victory is already sitting right in front of them? And the answer has very little to do with dialogue. It has very little to do with plot. In fact, the real magic happens in the way Steven Spielberg directs the scene. The camera, the blocking, the movement, the tiny details most viewers never consciously notice. Everything is carefully designed to make us feel exactly what Carl is feeling. At first, confidence, then uncertainty, then confusion, and finally, doubt. Because that's how Frank wins. He doesn't overpower people. He doesn't outrun them. He doesn't outfight them. He makes them doubt themselves. That's what separates Frank from most movie con artists. He's not selling fake checks. He's not selling fake identities. He's selling certainty. He walks into a room and behaves like he belongs there, and people believe him. Again, and again, and again. The motel scene is the perfect example of that skill. In less than 10 minutes, Spielberg shows us exactly how Frank operates. Not through exposition, not through narration, but through pure visual storytelling. By the time the scene ends, we understand something important. The movie was never really about forged checks. It was never really about airplanes, or doctors, or lawyers. It's about perception. It's about confidence. It's about how easily people can be convinced to ignore what is right in front of them. And no scene demonstrates that better than this one. Because for the first time in the entire film, Frank has nowhere left to run. Which means the only weapon he has left is himself. Before Carl ever enters the room, Spielberg is already telling us something is wrong. On paper, this should be the easiest part of the arrest. He knows where Frank is. He has a weapon. He has the element of surprise. All he has to do is walk down a hallway and open a door. But Spielberg doesn't shoot the moment like a victory lap. He shoots it like a horror scene. The first thing we see is Carl climbing the motel stairs. It's a small detail, but notice the angle. The camera is looking down on him. Normally, when directors want a character to appear powerful, they shoot from below. The low angle makes them feel larger, more dominant, more dangerous. Spielberg does the opposite. He's already quietly taking power away from Carl. Then comes another tiny detail. Carl reaches for his gun and fumbles it. It's only a second. Most viewers barely notice it. But moments like this are rarely accidents in Spielberg films. The stumble tells us something important. Carl isn't completely comfortable. He's nervous, maybe even scared. And honestly, why wouldn't he be? For months he's been chasing a ghost, a criminal who somehow always disappears before he arrives. Now, for the first time, he believes the chase is finally over. But Spielberg keeps introducing little obstacles. A maid crosses the hallway. Carl has to stop, wait, adjust. Nothing dramatic happens, but that's exactly the point. Every interruption delays the confrontation. Every delay increases the tension. Then Spielberg does something clever. The camera stops moving. Carl keeps walking. But the camera stays where it is. As Carl gets farther away, he becomes smaller and smaller inside the frame. It's subtle, but psychologically, it changes how we see him. Instead of moving toward victory, he looks like he's moving into danger, like he's walking into something he doesn't fully understand. And that's really what this scene is about. Not Frank, Carl, because Carl thinks he's hunting Frank, when in reality, he's walking directly into Frank's world. Then Spielberg cuts behind him. The hallway is darker now. Carl becomes partially silhouetted. We can't fully read his face. And just like Carl, we can't fully see what's ahead. The uncertainty starts building, not through dialogue, not through music, through visual information. Then comes one of my favorite shots in the entire sequence. A quick push forward from behind Carl. It's only a moment long, but it creates urgency. The camera almost feels impatient, like it's dragging us toward the room, toward whatever is waiting behind that door. And then Spielberg gives us the image everything has been building toward, Carl's gun, pointed directly at the motel room. Notice how the gun leads our eyes. Not Carl's face, not his emotions, the gun. The confrontation arrives in the frame before it arrives in the story. We're preparing for violence. We're preparing for an arrest. We're preparing for the movie to finally deliver on its title, Catch Me If You Can. But Spielberg has one more surprise. The door is already open. Just slightly. Enough to feel wrong. Enough to make us ask a question. If Frank is inside, why would he leave the door open? And suddenly, something changes. A moment ago, we were expecting Carl to catch Frank. Now we're wondering if Carl is about to walk into a trap. And that's the genius of Spielberg's direction. Nothing important has happened yet. Nobody has spoken. Nobody has been arrested. Nobody has escaped. Yet somehow, every shot has quietly shifted the balance of power. Carl still thinks he's in control, but Spielberg is already showing us the truth. He's not. Carl reaches the door, and Spielberg immediately does something unexpected. The door is already open. Just a little. Not enough to reveal what's inside, just enough to feel wrong. Think about what we've been conditioned to expect. The FBI agent finds the room. The suspect is trapped. The confrontation begins. That's how these scenes usually work. But Spielberg understands something important. Tension doesn't come from answers. It comes from uncertainty. The slightly open door creates uncertainty. Why is it open? Did Frank leave? Is he waiting inside? Does he know Carl is coming? We don't know. And Carl doesn't know either. Then Carl bursts into the room. The camera rushes forward with him. For a brief moment, it feels like everything is about to explode. This is the payoff we've been waiting for. The arrest. The confrontation. The moment the chase finally ends. And then, nothing. Absolutely nothing. No Frank. No struggle. No dramatic reveal. Just silence. It's a perfect anticlimax. And that's exactly why it works. Most directors would reward the audience's anticipation. Spielberg delays it. Again. The tension doesn't disappear, it actually gets stronger, because now we're confused. The camera swings around the room as Carl looks for answers. Notice something interesting. Spielberg refuses to give us a proper establishing shot. We never get a clean overview of the room. We never fully understand the layout. Instead, we're forced to discover the space piece by piece. Exactly like Carl. This is one of Spielberg's favorite techniques. The audience only knows what the character knows. No more, no less. Which means we're just as lost as he is. Then Spielberg shows us something that seems completely insignificant. Carl steps on a potato chip. We cut down. Crumbs, candy wrappers, junk food. It's such a strange detail, especially for the man Carl has spent the entire movie chasing. Think about how Carl imagines Frank, a master criminal, a professional fraudster, a criminal genius operating across the country. But this room tells a different story. This room belongs to a teenager, a messy teenager. And suddenly the illusion starts cracking. Not Frank's illusion, Carl's. For the first time, we're reminded that beneath all the uniforms, fake identities, and forged checks, Frank is still just a kid. A kid pretending to be an adult. A kid pretending to belong in a world much bigger than himself. Then Spielberg gives us another sound, a toilet flush. Immediately, Carl spins around. And look at how quickly the energy changes. A second ago, he was investigating. Now he's reacting. The room has taken control of him. The camera cuts closer. The gun dominates the frame. Carl raises it. For the first time in the scene, Spielberg gives us a proper close-up. And what do we see? Not confidence, not certainty, nervousness. Carl is rattled. Because the closer he gets to catching Frank, the less control he seems to have. Then Spielberg frames the bathroom door, Carl on one side, the unseen figure on the other. Everything suddenly becomes simple. The room, the evidence, the confusion, all of it disappears. Now there's only one question left. Who's about to walk through that door? And for the first time in the scene, it genuinely feels like anything could happen. And then the bathroom door opens. This is the moment the entire scene has been building toward. Carl has his gun raised. The camera is locked onto the doorway. The tension is at its highest point. For the last few minutes, Spielberg has been making us expect one thing: a confrontation, maybe a struggle, maybe an arrest. At the very least, some kind of resistance. Instead, Frank calmly walks out. And that's the first sign that Carl is in trouble. Because Frank doesn't look scared. He doesn't look surprised. He doesn't look like someone who has just been cornered by the FBI. He looks prepared, almost as if he knew this moment was coming. That's what makes the performance so fascinating. Leonardo DiCaprio doesn't play panic. He plays confidence. And confidence is far more dangerous. The second Frank starts talking, something interesting happens. The scene stops being about evidence and starts being about belief. Frank immediately creates a story. Not a complicated story, not a perfect story, just a story delivered with absolute certainty. And that's enough, because confidence is contagious. The more confident Frank sounds, the more Carl begins questioning himself. Notice how Spielberg stages the interaction. At first, Carl has all the power. He's holding the gun. He's controlling the frame. Frank is trapped. Visually, the scene couldn't be more one-sided. But then Frank starts moving. Slowly. Casually. Without asking permission. He steps forward. Carl doesn't. Frank keeps talking. Carl keeps listening. And little by little, the power starts shifting. This is where Spielberg's blocking becomes brilliant. If you mute the scene completely, you can still understand what's happening. Because the movement tells the story. Frank advances. Carl retreats. Frank occupies more space. Carl gives up space. The con isn't happening through dialogue. It's happening physically. Every step Frank takes is a test. Can I get a little closer? Can I take a little more control? Can I make this man doubt himself? And every time Carl allows it, Frank wins another small battle. What's remarkable is that Carl isn't stupid, quite the opposite. Throughout the entire movie, Carl is usually the smartest person in the room. But Frank understands something Carl doesn't. People don't trust authority. People trust certainty. And right now, Frank sounds more certain than Carl. The genius of the scene is that we can actually watch the exact moment Carl begins to believe him. Not completely, not yet, but enough. Enough to lower his guard, enough to stop acting and start listening, enough to give Frank the opening he needs. And that's the tragedy of the scene. Because Carl is finally standing face to face with the man he's been chasing. The hunt is over. The answer is right in front of him. Yet somehow, he's farther away from catching Frank than ever before. Because the moment Carl starts questioning his own instincts, the con is already working. And Spielberg is about to prove it with one of the smartest pieces of blocking in the entire film. By this point, Frank has done something remarkable. He's taken a situation that should be impossible to escape from and turned it into a conversation. But Spielberg isn't finished yet, because now comes the smartest part of the scene, the blocking. One of the reasons this sequence works so well is that Spielberg never tells us who is winning. He shows us. Watch where the characters are standing. When Frank first walks out of the bathroom, Carl owns the room. He's standing upright, gun raised, occupying the center of the frame. Frank is the one trapped. Frank is the one being questioned. Frank is the one who should be nervous. But then something starts changing, very slowly, almost invisibly. Frank takes a step forward, then another, then another. And Carl starts moving backward. Not because Frank threatens him, not because Frank forces him, because Carl allows it. That's the difference. Every step Frank takes is a small victory. Every step Carl takes backward is a small defeat. And Spielberg makes sure we feel it. The room itself becomes part of the storytelling. Frank keeps expanding into the space. Carl keeps giving space away. What's fascinating is that neither character acknowledges it. The movement feels natural, casual, almost accidental, but it's doing all the heavy lifting. This is why great blocking is so powerful. Most viewers never consciously notice it. They just feel the shift, and that's exactly what's happening here. The balance of power is changing right in front of us. Then comes one of my favorite moments. Carl physically bumps into the room service tray. It's such a small thing, you could miss it entirely. But Spielberg doesn't include accidents by accident. The tray serves a purpose. Until now, Carl has been moving backward almost unconsciously. The tray suddenly makes him aware of it. For the first time, he literally runs out of room. And symbolically, that's exactly what's happening. Frank has pushed him as far back as possible. The hunter has become reactive. The prey is controlling the encounter. What's even more impressive is how little Frank actually says to achieve this. Most con artists in movies are written like magicians. They deliver impossible speeches, perfect arguments, unbelievable manipulations. Frank doesn't do any of that. His real weapon is certainty. He speaks as if his story is true, so people start treating it as true. And Carl begins doing the same thing. Notice how the questions change. At first, Carl is investigating, looking for proof, looking for answers. Now he's looking for reassurance. That's a completely different mindset. And Frank knows it. Because this isn't really a scene about deception. It's a scene about confidence. The confidence to walk into a room where an FBI agent is pointing a gun at you and somehow make him feel like he's the one who's mistaken. By now, Carl is still holding the weapon. Carl still has the authority. Carl still has every reason to arrest Frank. Yet somehow, none of that matters anymore. Because Frank has gained something far more valuable: control. And Spielberg is about to push that idea one final time with the most important object in the entire scene: a wallet. At this point, Frank has almost escaped. Almost. But Spielberg understands something important. The audience needs one last reason to doubt. One last moment where everything could fall apart. And that's where the wallet comes in. Frank gathers the evidence, keeps talking, keeps moving toward the door. Everything appears to be working. Carl is buying the story. The tension is fading. Or at least, it seems like it is. Then Carl says something simple: "Your wallet." And suddenly the entire scene changes. Because that wallet is a disaster. Inside is the truth. No Secret Service credentials. No badge. No proof that Frank is who he claims to be. Just evidence that the whole performance is a lie. For the first time since Frank walked out of the bathroom, he's trapped again. And Spielberg knows exactly how to make us feel it. Notice what happens next. Frank walks directly toward the camera. Closer, 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 until he practically fills the frame. It's uncomfortable. There's nowhere left to go, nowhere left to hide. The closer Frank gets, the more pressure we feel. Because we know something Carl doesn't. This entire con is hanging by a thread. One wrong move, 1 second of hesitation, one tiny crack in Frank's confidence, and everything ends. What's brilliant is that Leonardo DiCaprio barely changes his performance. Most actors would panic. They'd show fear. They'd telegraph the danger. Frank doesn't, because Frank understands the rule that has carried him through the entire movie. The moment people see uncertainty, you lose. So he stays calm, even though this is probably the most dangerous moment of the entire encounter. Then Spielberg gives us another incredible composition. We cut behind Carl. Frank is standing in the doorway, literally framed by the exit. A frame within a frame. Visually, it feels final, like the movie itself is asking a question. Can he actually walk through that door? Can he really get away with this? Everything we've seen tells us no. This has to be where the story catches up to him. This has to be where Carl finally wins. But Spielberg has been playing with our expectations from the beginning. Every time we think the confrontation is coming, it doesn't. Every time we expect the payoff, it gets delayed. And he does it one last time. Frank looks at Carl. Carl looks at Frank. The wallet sits between them. The truth is literally in Carl's hands. One look inside and it's over. The chase ends. The movie changes. Everything changes. And then Frank says something that sounds almost ridiculous. I trust you. That's it. No explanation, no argument, no desperation, just confidence. Pure confidence. And somehow, it works. Because Frank isn't really leaving Carl a wallet. He's leaving Carl a choice. Trust your instincts, or trust me. And Carl is about to make the wrong one. And then Frank walks out. Just like that. No running, no fighting, no dramatic escape. He simply leaves. And somehow that's the most unbelievable part of the entire scene. Because Carl lets him. Think about everything that has happened. Carl found the room, found the evidence, found the suspect, had a gun pointed directly at him. By every logical measure, this should have been the end of the movie. Instead, Frank walks through the doorway and disappears. What's fascinating is what Spielberg chooses to focus on next. Not Frank, Carl. The moment Frank leaves, the energy of the scene completely changes. Up until now, Carl has been standing, moving, reacting, trying to stay in control. Now he sits down. It's a tiny action, but it says everything. The man who entered the motel believing he had won now looks defeated. Not physically, mentally. Because deep down, part of him knows something isn't right. You can almost see the doubt forming. The story made sense, but did it really? The confidence felt real. But was it? The evidence is gone. Frank is gone. And Carl is left alone with a feeling he can't quite explain. That's what makes great cons so powerful. The victim doesn't immediately realize they've been fooled. Instead, the realization arrives slowly, piece by piece, question by question. And Spielberg leaves Carl sitting right in the middle of that process. Then there's the wallet. The wallet is still there, still sitting with Carl. And that's what makes Frank's final move so brilliant. Most con artists try to eliminate suspicion. Frank does the opposite. He leaves suspicion behind. On purpose. Because leaving the wallet makes his story feel stronger. Why would a criminal leave evidence? Why would a criminal willingly walk away from something that could expose him? Only an innocent person would do that. At least, that's what Carl is supposed to think. And for a moment, he does. That's the genius of the entire scene. Frank doesn't convince Carl he's telling the truth. He convinces Carl that lying would be impossible. There's a difference. One creates belief, the other removes doubt. And removing doubt is often much easier. That's why the scene works so well. It's not really about forgery. It's not really about fake identities. It's about psychology, about confidence, about understanding people. Frank wins because he understands something Carl doesn't. People see what they expect to see. Carl expected to meet a criminal. Frank gave him a federal agent. Carl expected panic. Frank gave him certainty. Carl expected someone trapped. Frank acted like he belonged there. And by the time Carl starts questioning any of it, the door has already closed. Frank is already gone. The con is already complete. But here's the beautiful part. This isn't actually the end of the scene. It's the beginning of something much bigger. Because the moment Carl realizes what happened, the chase stops being professional and becomes personal. For the rest of the movie, Frank isn't just the man Carl is hunting. He's the man who fooled him face to face and walked away smiling. And that's a humiliation Carl never forgets. And that's why this scene matters. Not because Frank escapes, not because Carl gets fooled, and not because it's one of the most entertaining sequences in the movie. It matters because this single scene quietly explains the entire film. When most people think about Catch Me If You Can, they think about the checks, the airplanes, the fake uniforms, the fake identities, the scams. But none of those things are actually Frank's greatest skill. His greatest skill is understanding people. Throughout the movie, Frank succeeds because he recognizes something most people don't. The world runs on confidence. Pilots are trusted because they look like pilots. Doctors are trusted because they look like doctors. Lawyers are trusted because they sound like lawyers. Most of the time, people aren't verifying reality. They're responding to signals. And Frank becomes a master at sending those signals. That's exactly what happens in the motel room. He doesn't escape because his story is perfect. His story isn't perfect. He escapes because Carl wants certainty. And Frank gives it to him. What's brilliant is that Spielberg builds the entire scene around that idea. Every camera movement, every piece of blocking, every shift in position, everything slowly transfers authority from Carl to Frank. By the end, the man with the gun is uncertain, and the man being arrested looks completely in control. That's the real trick. And it's also why the scene feels so satisfying. Because deep down, we know Carl should catch him. We know Frank is guilty. We know the lie should fall apart. Yet somehow we want to see whether he can pull it off. For a few minutes, Spielberg turns the audience into accomplices. We're rooting for the criminal, not because he's good, but because he's fascinating. That's one of the hardest things a movie can accomplish, making us admire someone we know is wrong. And Catch Me If You Can does it better than almost any film ever made. Which is why this scene remains so memorable more than 20 years later. Not because of action, not because of special effects, not because of some giant twist, but because it's built on something far more powerful. Human behavior. The need to believe. The fear of being wrong. And the confidence of a teenager who walks into a room, stares down an FBI agent, and convinces him to doubt his own eyes. That's what makes the scene great. And that's what takes Catch Me If You Can from a great movie to a masterpiece.